So, like Alan's mentioned there, we're going to go through our journey that we've been through over the last nearly 2 years now on demand. If we can move the slide on there, please, Alan. So that's just a quick agenda of what we're going to go through our starting journey, and then I'm going to hand over to Alan and the team who's going to talk through actually the specifics of what we've actually been doing and the intricacies of what's happened and what they've learned. Next one, please, Alan. So our journey started with a really negative HMIC report. We were heavily criticised in relation that we didn't understand our demand, and lots of our decisions were made on finances rather than actual need, and having that deep understanding. That came with a number of other causes of concern, which were well played out in the press. And we needed to get a massive move on, really, partly because a lot, as we know, the other decisions around changing the organisation need to be made on the back of a solid understanding of demand and process, which we needed to get the foundations in place really quickly. But what was really critical is we needed to be self-sufficient, because demand analysis needs to be ongoing. It needs to be replicated and refreshed as the world moves on. So we looked at around to see actually who could provide the type of service of like a blended model, and we found Process Evolution from speaking to some other forces. And as you can imagine, we did our due diligence before we signed the contract with Process Evolution, and all the feedback from everybody that we spoke to was incredibly positive around the organisation, the way that it's run, and the benefits of it, which was a massive win for us, really. The key aspect is that we had buy-in from the chief constable, who understands all this, who's been along the journey with us, who can actually quote some of the numbers better than we can as well. So it's been a mega benefit as well. Next slide, please, Alan. So the solution that we wanted is we wanted to be able to watch and learn, so that we had a team of 6 staff who could be with Process Evolution and watch actually how they deliver, how do they get the information from the focus groups to actually start to build the models. So we held lots of focus groups, and we shared our staff with Process Evolution staff to learn. And what was really key, that the feedback that we took from Process Evolution there was around making sure the teams are briefed well in advance, so that we maximise the opportunity in the focus groups, which we did from stakeholder engagement with managers, a paper brief to the actual team before the actual come on the day, and then actually on the day they get a personal brief, so that they fully understand what needs to be delivered on the day. And we had some very successful focus groups and some really good feedback from the team in from Process Evolution. One of the key benefits that we saw with using Process Evolution as well is all of the work was automatically getting benchmarked against other work that they've done. It's almost been like the matrix of checking against, well, actually, how far out of kilter is that with what we've seen elsewhere? And that was a massive benefit to us, especially around highlighting the back to HMIC to say, well, actually, things are not that bad around efficiency and effectiveness. It's other issues, and it was handy to be able to get some of those things sorted at the pass very quickly by that benchmarking. We've been using Niche now for 16 years, so we have a data mountain, which can be quite handy, but it can be a barrier as well, because you can have too much information. So we spent many of hours of going through the data to get to a model that we could start to use it in the builds. What's been quite handy as well then is around using Power BI to actually replicate the models for the future, which the team will go into. We also, it was really handy to have the professional discussion at all levels, so that the team came in and they were discussing it from the operational level right up to the chief officer team. They're quite open for questions and the debate, and always on hand to help, which helped for us to build our confidence as an organisation in ourselves, and see the credibility in the Process Evolution approach as well, which helped to win over the decision making in the organisation. I'll pass over to, I think, Alan next, I think.
Yep. So thank you for that, Glenn. My name's Alan. I'm a senior demand analyst at Cleveland. So I'm just going to run through a bit of an overview of the modelling we've done thus far, and then after that we will dive into some of the specific projects that we've done. So as I say, over the last 2 years, it's been a bit of a journey for us. So it started out with just a genuine need to better understand our demand, but because of the speed that we needed to do it, we've got a lot of experience with the process evolution toolset in a short period of time. Ultimately, the projects that we've taken on could be grouped into 3 categories. So there's the process evolution projects, which essentially things that process evolution did for us and we observed as part of the initial consultancy. The collaborative projects, which is things that we largely did in-house, but with support from process evolution in some very, very specific areas. And then more recently, some in-house projects where we've completed them entirely in-house. So just to give a bit of an overview on those, in terms of the process evolution projects, as part of the initial consultancy, they completed the demand model in the following areas. So we had a response profiler built for our IRT or incident resolution team. Then we had workload profilers built for the majority of our investigative teams, running through from CID to PHT, domestic abuse, our child abuse and vulnerable adults, online investigation teams, and sex offender management unit. During that, the Cleveland staff observed the modelling, like Glenn touched on, to make sure we gained an understanding of the processes that are followed through. And also we received training directly from them in terms of the use of an application of the models. In terms of some of the collaborative projects that we've completed, we completed our force control room, which was a call profiler and a workload profiler for different areas and different sections of the work, a harm and risk model using the harm tool, and a neighborhood profiler using the neighborhood profiler software. With those projects, we completed the majority of the work in the demand analysis in-house, but process evolution supported us with work in specific areas. So, for example, is Mark Bryant built the call profiler for us for the FCR, and the force geography for the harm tool was completely done by Ali, including helping us with a restructure of the force that we had at the time. And they also completed the activity analysis when we did the neighborhood profiler. So they were very much joint projects. And then more recently, our in-house projects. So some of this work's been completed and some of it's ongoing. But we've completed a workload profiler for our force crime management unit, a workload profiler for our response sergeants, our complex exploitation team, which is an ongoing piece of work. We're currently in the process of looking at all our specialist teams, including roads policing, firearms, motorcycles, and the dog section. We're just kicking off a piece of work for custody, and sort of as a proof of concept, one of our demand analysis, Graham Jones, actually built a workload profiler for our team so that we could accurately discuss capacity for us to do new work and refresh models over the course of a year. So within those projects, as I say, we completed the work and put together the findings and presentations or reports for the relevant commands as we went. So I'm going to move on to some specific projects over this course. We won't dive into them in the same depth of the previous presentation, but we're just going to give us a few of our considerations and outcomes over a few of them. So just to start with is the ones we'll be covering is we'll run quickly through the harm tool, the response sergeants, our complex exploitation team, the force control room, and the specialist teams. And to kick that off, we'll be starting with the harm tool. So I'm just going to hand you across to my colleague, Ben Wilson.
Thanks, Alan. So I'm just going to talk through our harm model process in the next 4 slides. So just to provide a bit of an overview to start. So the objective was to map risk across Cleveland and to provide an evidence base to sit alongside our neighbourhood profiler model, which ultimately is to allow for consideration when looking at the neighbourhood resources. Previously, we used the VLI, so the Vulnerable Localities Index, to distribute our resources. However, it had its limitations. So it was limited to just crimes, incidents and demographics, which all had equal weightings. The harm tool, on the other hand, allowed us to align the areas of risk to the force's priorities, and it also allowed us to apply weightings to the model as well. Next slide, Alan. So in terms of considerations, before starting the modelling process, we decided to validate our model first, our harm model, sorry. We did this against the VLI, and we were able to replicate the results at LSOA level. After that, the first step in the updated modelling process was to define how we measure harm and risk in the force. So what we did was we held workshops with our 4 chief inspectors within the neighbourhood teams, and also spoke to a member of our intelligence team as well, just to help us define the risk families and metrics. And then from those discussions, we identified 6 risk families, which were crimes, vulnerability, offenders, demographics, incidents, and geography, which had between 3 and 10 risk metrics for each of those of those 6 families. So just some more considerations as well. So once we had the families defined, the next step was to assign weightings to each. So for this, we asked everyone involved to create their own scenario, analyse the result, and then held further meetings to agree a force average scenario. So just to expand on that point a bit further and just sort of break it down, once we had all the risk families and metrics, what we did was sent a spreadsheet to all 4 of our chief inspectors, asking for their own perspective, and just to provide their own weightings to each metric. We then collated the responses, made a scenario for each individual within the model, and then we also worked out a force average based on each response. And then after that, we held a meeting with everyone just to see if it felt about right with them all as well. And as well as the modelling process was underway, it was required that our force geography had to be updated. 2 reasons for this were changes to the wards in one of our LPAs, and the LPA restructuring its neighbourhood sectors from 3 to 2 as well. And for consistency, LSOAs were assigned to wards by reviewing which boundary their population centre sat within. And again, just to do that in a more positive light, it was probably quite useful that we encountered this on our first model build as well, as this year's census, again, is likely to lead to LSOA changes as well next year for when we refresh the model. And also we'll have a good understanding of that when it comes round. Next slide, Alan. So lastly, just in terms of the outcomes from the harm model, so the tool provided us with a breakdown of harm and risk across the force area at different geographical levels. So looking at the distribution of officers solely against risk, it demonstrated to us that one LPA was potentially overstaffed, while another was significantly understaffed. It's also important probably to mention as well that this isn't taking into account any operational factors, just purely harm and risk. But these findings did echo qualitative feedback that we'd received during the process. So as a team, we did feel fairly comfortable with the results. And then finally, the results were presented to the senior leadership team, who requested a written report detailing the findings, which we have now sent to them, and it's ultimately down to them now to make that final decision. I'll hand over to you. I think it's you next, Graham.
Thanks, Ben. Can I have the next slide, please, Alan? So I'm Graham Jones. I'm a project officer within the demand analysis team, and I'll just talk you through some of the work that we did with our response sergeants, which was one of our first independent model builds. So this was mainly to build on work that was already completed by Process Evolution, who had done the response profiler, but the response sergeants were out of scope, so we were to go back in and to look at the workload that the response sergeants had on them, and that would be based on both the current demand that they currently faced, and then also what the future would look like in terms of what had been agreed in force to move us to some changes to this force structure, as we would call it, as scenario 1.2. Response sergeants were dynamic business area, 24/7 coverage 7 days a week, and they were often the first point of contact for all our internal departments as well. And one of the things we found straight away was that they had a budget of 50 FTE, but these posts contained a high number of acting up and temporary sergeants. We had previously allocated staff purely on supervisory ratios. So whilst we had the evidence behind sort of like the number of response officers we needed, there wasn't so much an evidence base behind the number of response sergeants we needed to actually not only supervise the staff, but also to undertake the tasks that they would be tasked to do. And we found very early doors that the feedback we had from response sergeants sort of like stood out as that this was quite a specialist post, and every workshop we ran sort of came back to us and said that we're dealing with a high level of risk and possibly threat and harm in this post as well, and we've got a daily need to spin plates because we're doing multiple tasks at once, and we don't necessarily know what task is coming in next. Next slide, please, Alan. So some of the considerations we had to consider was really understanding the demand faced by response sergeants. It was difficult as really force data only told us part of the story. So in order to better understand our demand and the demand that response sergeants face, we had to look at some bespoke data sets, and these data sets were also used to validate what the response sergeants had told us in the workshops. So we were able to get data sets for incoming internal and external phone calls. We didn't include any phone calls that response sergeants made because we captured that in the work that they were doing. But from one of the first workshops, we found there were a number of phone calls coming into them and the phone just didn't stop ringing. And we also conducted analysis of handover sheets. We were able to extract data from Niche for the sergeant's inboxes, PPN submissions, and the overall crime management tasks that they needed to do. And we were able to get storm data for the live incident management, time spent at scene, and also high risk missing from homes as well. And we used fleet data for the maintenance, and we were able to get HR data for sickness, overtime, and leave requests on the basis that our response sergeants still were inputting those on the system, and that was a workload for them. And we also use Workload Profiler to create delivery profiles to not only understand what the tasks they were doing, but also when the tasks were happening. So was this early in the morning? Was it afternoon? Was it on the evening? It was also necessary for us to understand the impact of the high proportion of student officers within our response teams, because the force made the decision to front load the recruitment of additional officers, and all those were placed within the response teams. Next slide, please, Alan. So from our initial findings, as based on current demand, we found that the model actually supported what was being told to us by response sergeants. We found that the sergeants were considerably overutilised when compared to the budget establishments. As you can see there was a high utilisation rate, and the majority of these were around the incident related activities as well as the crime related activities, and then the activities related to the handover process, followed by the supervision related activities. And we actually used South Wales Police as well as kind of a go-to friend in terms of benchmarking our findings with themselves, just to talk through what we've done and also what they did as well, which we found really helpful. And that was a big thanks to the team at South Wales as well for allowing us that opportunity. Next slide, please, Alan. So the delivery profiles that we created from system data definitely supported the feeling that demand outweighed available resources on day shift, which was one of the key elements that came out of our findings. And we just got two examples there of the niche tasks and the time of day that they were tasked in. So it was a big rise in the morning, and also the number of phone calls as well. There was definitely peaks when response sergeants were coming on to shift because the rest of the force was also coming on to shift. So the knock-on impact of this demand was that it was also being felt in the afternoon. The sergeants told us that it felt like they were putting the wheels back on from the morning shift. And again, we identified that accounting for current coping mechanisms being used by the sergeants, such as they were quite open with us and sort of like say, well, you know, we do work at home on rest days. Next slide, please, Alan. So when we modelled to the changes in scenario 1.2, we found that although crime allocation would reduce and also supervisory activities would reduce due to the student officers becoming longer in service and whatnot and become more experienced, therefore wouldn't necessarily need a sergeant's input as much. We found that the model would support that utilisation would drop, but there was potentially still more work required to be done. over the coming year or so. Next slide, please, Alan. So if we move on to the complex exploitation team that we've just started in the process of near completed, this was one of the areas that our force management statement highlighted to us as a concern, and that was for the following reasons. We found that during the FMS in answering steps 1 and steps 2, that there was kind of a partial or limited knowledge of current or future demands, and coupled with that, there was a large upward trend in CSE and CCE demand. So we were able to demonstrate that we'd seen a 200% increase in the previous 12 months. And also findings showed that there was kind of a lack of experience and investigation skills and accreditation amongst those currently dealing with said offences. And that was on the back of a workshop that Process Evolution held as well. And beneficial for us was that the department had recently undergone an internal review, an internal 12-month review since it had changed to the set team, and we felt that this was a good opportunity to create a baseline model, piggybacking on the back of what they found as well once they did that review. Next slide, please. So some of the considerations that we had in this area was that it, as the name suggests, it was a complex area of business that brought several challenges to work around. And one of the big challenges was that the department supported itself to deal with demand. So in order to deal with demand, when we started the workshops and the model, we'd actually found that one of the sort of like sub-teams had been disbanded in order to facilitate the operational demand, whereas other areas such as CID may call in abstractions from other areas that within the set world that was purely sort of like internal, so they just move officers from one sub-team into another team. And apart from the crime investigations data, there was kind of no real source of force data. So we found there was a lot of spreadsheets or a lot of data held in other areas such as the intranet, where it kind of wasn't formally recorded or wasn't as easy to find. There was a lot of kind of validation needed, and a lot of we have used some assumptions which we've documented to help us repeat the process. And that there was, as you mentioned there was substantial internal abstractions to operations, both proactive and reactive. And unlike a CID where a crime had been committed and then they were staffing that crime, we found that there was staff abstracted to do long-running proactive operations and also reactive operations when intelligence or crimes had been committed and were tasked in. So we had to make some considerations as to how best to model this, and we did that, and we validated this with the chief inspector from the set team as well. I think that comes to the end, Alan.
Yeah, thank you, Graham. So I'm just going to run through our force control room project first. So this originated because the FCR was struggling to meet its demand, and also some changes were required in force needed to be considered to improve our crime recording standards, which came from our force crime registrar. So the demand review for the force control room actually encompassed a lot of different areas, which has included call taking, dispatch, so desktop investigation for resolutions without deployment, a force crime management unit, and a vulnerability desk, which is something we have internally to support with domestic incidents. So at this stage, the force control room was set up from an omni-competence model, and they were looking to move away from that and create some specialist teams within the FCR. So the first place that we started was actually the force crime management unit. I just mentioned the omni-competence model. So at that time, the we didn't actually have a official team set up for crime recording. So, but the tasks were being carried out by people within the force control room. So what we needed to do is, in order to create that model, is we need to create it by grouping the crime recording tasks together, as opposed to being able to represent a full existing team. So it was, to a degree, it was almost theoretical modeling when we did that. So during the data period, we actually used, one of the main issues we ran into was that the call demand is complicated by both internal changes and external changes over the period of time we were looking at. So over a 3-year period, we had a switchboard in place at the start of the data period, but it was removed. The average handling and wrap times were impacted by a move away from omnicompetence into specialisms, and also we had the demand reduction that occurred as a result of COVID. All the things we needed to consider when looking at the call data. In terms of that, actually, just to touch on it before I move on, when we analysed the call data, in the end, what we actually did is we used the pre-COVID demand data to represent volumes, so the calls that would be going through the FCR, but we used the more recent handling times and wrap times to more accurately represent what we thought it would look like in the future, and that was all verified with the room, with the FCR itself and the command, and signed off and validated. So another concern we had was around the dispatch staffing requirements, which were introduced as part of a previous shift pattern review. When the way that was set up was that you would have a certain number of resources on during the day, which would drop down to a lower number in the early hours of the morning when there was less incidents. When we actually had an examination of the time of the incidents were open as opposed to the time that they occurred, then that showed that the resources were dropping down too early. And we also received some qualitative feedback from the room that there were risks posed by the lower number of dispatches overnight. So we needed to consider that as part of the modelling to make sure that the officers attending incidents had the right information when they were attending. And finally, the desktop investigation had previously been assigned to PCs in the FCR on an ad hoc basis. So in terms of actually getting processing times, that proved quite difficult because each officer sort of did it their way, if you like. But during the modelling cycle, a temporary unit was created to formalise that process. And what that actually allowed us to do was to complete some activity analysis and obtain higher quality data around the processing times. So once we actually completed the modelling, what we found is that to service demand and introduce the new functions, the FCR would require a growth of 20 FTE. Over the course of time, the findings were presented in the forms of reports, which Mark Bryant from Process Evolution kindly helped us with, so thanks for that, Mark. And the full findings actually went to both the senior leadership team and our Police and Crime Commissioner, and the growth's been approved. So as a result of the modelling, at this moment in time, the implementation of the new structure is currently underway. And we've also working with Process Evolution around shift pattern to support the new structure once it's actually been in. Another piece of work that we're currently in the middle of is our specialist teams. So currently they sit in collaboration with another force, and it's under review whether that still meets the force requirements or not. So our demand review is going to be specific to our force and not the collaboration. And we're looking to identify the resources required to service the demand that's unique to our force. The demand review for that includes firearms, roads policing, including our motorcycles, our dog section, strategic roles, including camera enforcement, traffic management, casualty reduction, collision investigation, and vehicle examination. What we found with the specialist teams is that abstractions form a major part of their working life. There's a significant volume of them, and one of the issues we've established within the force is that the different specialisms have their own training departments, which means we can't pull it all from one place. So what we've actually started to do is use the National Mercury system to identify all the specialisms and then work backwards from there in terms of what we need to get. So essentially we're using Mercury to identify all the training requirements that will be required of anyone in a specific role, and then going back to the training departments to get exactly what we need for those and which specialisms we do have, because not every specialism will be represented within our force. One of the other considerations we're looking at is identifying core and non-core tasks. Again, it's proved difficult because that can be very subjective. So we've been trying to establish agreements before proceeding with the models. that one of the best examples I can give of that is in terms of the motorcycles. So when we held workshops with the practitioners, when we asked them what their core activities were, one of the common themes that they said was abnormal loads. However, on further investigation, abnormal loads are completed entirely in they're not completed during on-shift time. It's majority being done on rest days. So we're in ongoing conversations about how to represent that in the model, because when we're looking at obviously resources, it's whether we include the abnormal loads, assuming it would be during an on-shift task, or if the assumption is going to be it will remain on rest days, because it's not something we have to do as a force, it's something we do. Another area that we're considering at the moment is building up a data picture of the team's incident attendance, as it's requiring several different data sources. So, for example, we use the System Chronicle to gain references for our firearms jobs, but the only data it will store from that we were able to extract from it in terms of a process timing perspective is when the Firearms Authority was active. And that's not representative of the whole time taken for a job. So, for example, our firearms team could be dispatched for 6 hours, but the Firearms Authority could only be active for 15 minutes. So that's not something we can use. So we're having to tally that in with other systems to make sure we represent the processing time correctly. And then one final area that we are considering is we have a large amount of roads policing workload being proactive, such as the Tier 1 campaigns, proactive work with OCGs, etc. And it can be difficult to quantify proactive time. So we're currently looking at trying to capture it by looking at the storm data for statuses. Once we've actually captured it all, we'll assess its suitability with some practitioners, but it's probably likely that we're going to need to go from look at an activity analysis from that point, that we won't be able to get out with the data. So they're the specific projects that we touched on there. Just finally, last thing I want to run through is just our key learnings and next steps from over the course of the last couple of years. So the first one would be that the process evolution tools are very intuitive to build up around the data inputs. But the trick is obtaining the data to input in the first place. Like we just discussed for specialist operations, there are a lot of different ways to view it, and it's making sure that we get the right consensus across the force. What we found is if we start by familiarizing ourselves with the tool we intend to use prior to the workshops, because we find that useful to focus the conversation in terms of what we actually need. Next thing would be specific in workshops with practitioners. The most common answer to how long do things take is how long's a piece of string. There's the common theme is that there is no such thing as an average, which is obviously what we're trying to coax out of them. So there've been times where we felt we've been specific, but once we've actually went away and looked at the information we've pulled, we've realized we haven't been specific enough. So over time, what we've found is trying to break a process down first, and then talking about each individual component to try and get sort of processing times, rather than start with an overlying question, because that causes problems up front. Another key learning would be to verify tasks, volumes, and processing times. So what we've started to do is, almost as a checklist throughout the modeling process, is when we're dealing with practitioners, is once we've got to a point where we think we understand the tasks, we think we know what the volume is over the course of a year, and we think we know what the processing times are, we send that back out to the practitioners that we've been dealing with, just for a final check, just to say, are you happy this represents the tasks? Is there anything that is in there that shouldn't be in there? Anything that's not in there that should be? Do you feel the processing times are right? Just to get that extra tick in the box before we go to the commands. And then ultimately we do the same thing with the command. So we have that validation all the way through the model build. And we find that increases confidence in the model outputs, and also it engages the practitioners in the process as well, because it's not just a case of we speak to them and then we never talk to them again, is that they're involved throughout. And one of the things is we've touched on is that we intend on refreshing our models on an annual basis. So we're building data documents to sit alongside the model. because there's nothing to say that a model I built this year, for example, the FCR, wouldn't be Ben's responsibility next year, or alternatively, Graham's building the CET model and I could be responsible for it next year. So what we're trying to do is build up a document that every piece of data within the model, we can understand where it comes from without having to do a significant handover. And that's one thing we're really focusing on getting done this year. And what we found is it also helps us in building those up. It also helps with scrutiny further down the line, especially as after we've moved on from an area. The FCR before we got the authorization was a recurring theme that we needed to go back, and the data documents really helped us always keep on point and making sure we were being consistent in our answers to any questions. So just finally, our next steps. So as a force, our journey to date's given us a better understanding of where we are in our demand, but there's still work to do because especially against an evolving landscape as we come out of COVID. We've had great buy-in from the work we've been completing, and we can already see changes being implemented across the force as a result. Initially, I mentioned the consultancy work process evolution did, and a lot of the investigative departments have been restructured within our force management statement as a result to reflect those resourcing requirements, as well as the FCR work. We've created our demand analysis team. Ultimately, that exists to maintain the momentum and the focus within the team. So Graham alluded to it when we looked at CET, we're using the force management statement to identify areas where we need to look at for the creation of new models in new years to make sure we understand our demands in those areas, and also make sure we're updating any of our existing models with new data and processes. We're constantly evolving and changing as a force, so we'll be there to support that over the years to come. And the findings from our creation of new models will then feed back into our FMS, which means the areas we have covered, we've already done a lot of the work for the FMS for that area before the starting. So basically, we're trying to generate a cyclic process year on year where we use the FMS to move forward and then feed back into it at the end. And that's everything from us. Does anyone have any questions? I've put our contact details on the screen, so I know obviously this might not be the forum, but if anyone wants to get in touch with anything, feel free.
Thanks, Alan. I think Peter had a question to start with. That's okay.
Hi guys. Yeah, thanks for that presentation. That was great. Really interesting, and really impressed with the amount that you've got through in a relatively short period of time since you had access to the software. So well done. It was just a question on the sergeants one, really. You sort of obviously identified a need for more response sergeants. I just wondered whether you got any, whether the force had got any authorization to increase its response sergeant numbers yet.
Graham, you presented that work. Are you okay answering that?
I did, yeah. We presented the work, but we've had no formal agreement in sort of like resourcing for response sergeants yet. There's still a lot of work happening in the background in terms of resolution without deployment that could impact the response sergeant world. It mainly just looked on like changes that we knew were going to happen to the other areas. So as of yet, there's been no additional resourcing put into the response sergeant world.
Okay, thanks for that. A supplementary question is, did you get a feel in your work, because I know this is something that we come across quite a bit anecdotally with forces, as to how much impact the uplift programme has had on response sergeant workload? I think you said that was one of the scenarios that you ran in terms of looking further ahead when those recruits are then become fully up to speed with what they're meant to be doing. That sort of drops down. I guess it looked like it was about 3 or 4 officers it made a difference in, but I just wondered how much quantification you got around that.
Yeah, we used the figures that Mark presented to us in the response profile of work, in that I think around about 50% of our response at the time were actually student officers. And then we worked towards the scenario whereby I think 4 or 5% through natural people retiring or resigning and then being replaced by student officers. So we we drop the numbers down to sort of like replicate that as a sort of like a year-on-year typical year that we'd expect this amount of student officers to be put back into to response, and we based our figures on those numbers.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Were there any additional questions? Okay, so if you do want to contact Cleveland, the contact details are there. And yeah, thank you very much for that. For me, I just want to reiterate Peter's point of the sheer breadth of work that seems to go through. It's quite amazing that you've got FCR, specialist teams, neighbourhoods, response, investigations, touching a lot of areas within the force.